Hello, welcome to the next lecture in this accelerator and beam physics course. Today we will be talking about basically in an accelerator facility, what are the peripheral systems, namely the systems other than what we discussed last time. Last time we just discussed the fundamentals which are needed to transport the beam and accelerate the beam. That is some source of electric field for acceleration and some mode for bending and focusing the beam. But that cannot work in isolation without several other peripheral systems. So we will be breaking up our discussion of these peripherals into two parts. Today we will be discussing about the power requirements of accelerators and how those can be satisfied, how those are achieved. Similarly, what is vacuum requirement and how different vacuum parameters are affecting the transport of the beam. And finally, we will be looking at the I mean, not in detail, I suppose, but also cooling is required. We'll be discussing this at various stages rather than cooling as a separate topic. But we will be looking at all of these things. Under the heading of cooling, actually, I mean, we will be covering both um ordinary air-based cooling, water-based cooling, as well as cryogenics. Mane going down to extremely low temperatures for some purposes. Okay. And next time we'll be looking at how to find out whether the beam is traveling the way you intend or not. That is beam diagnostic techniques that we will look at next time. Okay, let us move forward with this. Basically, this slide shows you the different roles or different types of people or groups that are involved when an accelerator facility has to be operated. Okay. Uh, you can have a look at this and you can have a look at the interconnections. Actually, in the regular course of the accelerator and beam physics course, during offline mode, my usual approach was to actually do a kind of role play type of thing in class. What I mean by that is the attempt used to be that each of the students can have a different role assigned to them. One person will be the physicist, one person will be the building designer or architect, one person will be the power plant designer, and so on. And each person will be given a set of bullet points, and then they have to present one or two questions to the entire group. That is, whom will they ask about certain things, and so on. That is not very feasible in the current situation. But if you want, we can do that as an activity also. Okay. You let me know, because most of you seem very reluctant to actually unmute the mic. I don't know why. So if that is the case, then this activity won't work. We'll try to work it out next time. Okay. Anyway, it's a very complex and very uh, intricate web where there are several dependencies from several different perspectives. For example, there is a group which will be in charge for the water cooling and air conditioning. Now, these people have to be in touch with the magnet designer because the magnets require cooling. They have to be in touch with the power supply designer because the power supply also requires cooling many times. They have to be in touch with the um, actual physics aims of the experiment, because there may be other things like the vacuum systems, etc., which require cooling, and other detectors, etc., which will require cooling. Then they should be in touch with the controls group, because all of this should be automated. If cooling shuts off in any particular sector of the accelerator, then there should be a safeguard of how to handle the beam and so on. So all the um, all the parameters which are monitored by the air conditioning group have to be in a format such that the controls group can directly use it as a integrated part of the control of the accelerator. So this guy will be having to simultaneously talk with four guys and then come up with his design. Similarly, the control expert will have to talk with everything from electrical plant to the particle physicist to the magnet designer to the water cooling and the power supply. Power supply guy will have to talk to the electrical plant and also the building, because where will you place all the power supplies? And you get the picture, I suppose, that each and every one of these people doesn't have one variable but several variables. So it's a very complex map which you will have to resolve even before you start, I mean, putting up the first brick or first part or component of your accelerator. At the design stage, all these different people, all of these are experts in their own domain, but they don't know anything about the other person's domain. For example, when we set up the accelerator mass spectrometer lab in UDP, uh, the architect doesn't know the what is accelerator mass spectrometry, but he knows how to build a building, how to design a building. So we had to sit down, several meetings were there, and finally the design was approved, such that in the design, whatever is the specification of the supplier of the instrument, that is the accelerator mass spectrometer supplied by a company called High Voltage Engineering Europa, which is in Netherlands, HVEE. So HVE had sent a layout where they said that these are the load bearing parts where you need where all the load or weight of the accelerator will be concentrated at certain points. Then the architect had to accordingly design the uh, structure such that it can bear that much of load. And at the same time, the architect has to look at several other parameters. Each and every individual involved has to look at all these parameters. As physicists, we learned a lot about building design and so on. There can be things as simple as how to prevent rats from coming inside, because there will be ducts for carrying the wires and all from the outside to the inside. In accelerator mass spectrometer facility, there is a cooling tower which is outside the building, and there is a air conditioning unit, main unit, which is outside the building. There is a water cooler. I told you that water. There is a cooling tower. So all of these, there is an air compressor outside the building. So all of these, the air and the cooling water, etc., is carried inside from outside. So through that duct through which all these cables comes, rats also come many times. So we had to work out how to ensure that you don't have rats, all these kind of things, So a lot of things have to be taken into account before an actual accelerator facility gets even commissioned. I mean not commissioned, even in the planning stage, these things have to be taken into account. Commissioning is the last stage where you actually start operating. Okay. So today we will have a look at few of these aspects. This is just an example of a large accelerator, like a large synchrotron facility, maybe even CERN or something. What you can see here is that this is the accelerator tube through which the acceleration or accelerated beam is passing through. And you can see that there is another tunnel in parallel where the power supplies are housed. So the power supply which comes from the main grid goes to this particular distribution unit, and then it is distributed to different parts of the accelerator. For a large accelerator, all the power distribution cannot happen from one particular place only. So you will have around the entire ring, you will have 7 or 8 such power substations which will be supplying power to that particular part of the accelerator. For a smaller accelerator, this can be one single unit, but still the point is it will take up almost equal amount of space as the actual accelerator itself. Many times slightly more space. Accelerator may be compact, it may be, suppose you have a tabletop size accelerator, the power supply for that can be bigger than that. It may need a separate room for housing it. Okay. So the power distribution in an accelerator from the, sorry, from the grid is itself a broad subject for electrical engineering and the architect to consider how the power distribution will take place. I mean, it can be simple things like where do you want the switchboard in the layout, because it should not happen that it is in some region where when the accelerator is operating there will be some radiation. Then the switchboard cannot be there, main switch etc. cannot be in that place. Then is there some part where there is a high voltage supply as part of the accelerator? Then again, it doesn't make sense for having the switchboard etc. close to that. This is just the switchboard related things. Where do you want to place things? All of these things have to be planned very carefully. And this is all part of the design phase of the accelerator, right? Because after designing and building the building, you cannot now say abhi mere ko ye badal ke do kind of thing. You cannot do that. So a lot of planning goes in for the power supply and its distribution in the accelerator. Okay. uh, where is the major power requirement arising for accelerators? This is an example of a probably electron positron collider type of machine. So you can see that there will be these RF cavities, which are basically the accelerating cavities. As the particle passes through that, it will get accelerated. Then there are bending magnets, which will bend the beam. Of course, not all the bending magnets have been shown. Just some of them are shown for illustrative purpose. And there will be focusing magnets at regular intervals. The magnets and the RF power supplies together, they constitute 70 to 90% of the total power cost of the accelerator. So out of the total power consumed by the accelerator, actually maximum goes in the bending magnets, and then also significant amount in the focusing magnets, as well as the RF cavities which are going to accelerate the beam. So all of these power requirements have to be taken into account. Power capacity of the power supply unit or power supply grid which you are going to use should be sufficient. All these parameters are there, and all these obviously have to be taken into account at the design phase when you are calculating the power requirement. And so several models have been developed for each of these individual components, whereby one can estimate the amount of power required. Okay. But the point here is that the magnets and the RF cavity together constitute 70 to 90% of the total power cost for the entire accelerator. This is just a just a kind of poster type slide where a lot of information is compressed into one slide. It illustrates the concept of RF acceleration and the type of power supply which is used for supplying power for RF acceleration. RF acceleration, the basic theme of RF acceleration is that you have an AC power supply between two plates, and whenever a particular part of the half cycle is going on, the electric field will point in the left to right direction, and you make the beam arrive at this position exactly when this situation is occurring, so that when the beam enters, it will experience an accelerating field. Of course, after some time, these arrows will point the other way, but at that time, you ensure that no beam is coming in. The beam is as you say, bunched in a particular way, so that it will always enter only when the positive acceleration cycle is going on. This is a side-on view of the same concept. It's a slightly different structure, but the concept is the same. That you have a very large electric field in the positive direction, so that when the beam enters, it will experience an accelerating field. For the purpose of power calculations, what is often done is that the RF cavity can be treated as a basic LCR type of circuit, where L is inductance and C is capacitance. But inside this RF cavity, the two end plates can be treated as a capacitor, and when the current is flowing from one plate to the other, means when the electric field is basically changing direction, uh, that particular phase can be thought of as an induction phase. And the resistance which is drawn here actually represents the amount of power transferred from this cavity to the beam. So basically, whenever the beam gains energy, the cavity or the plate arrangement which is here, it loses energy. That energy loss is represented in the form of a resistive energy loss. It's just a model. This LCR circuit model is what is used to determine how much power requirement is there for each cavity. So basically, the calculation goes as how much power do I want to transfer to the beam particle in each time it passes through the cavity. Accordingly, using I square R kind of logic, one can arrive at what is the value of R, where the resistance actually represents the beam gaining energy from the cavity. Okay. And the inductance and capacitance values are determined from the dimensions of the cavity, so that one can then obtain a suitable model for the cavity and obtain how to get maximum power transferred to the beam. Of course, we'll be studying this in detail, but this is just a trailer that for the power requirement part, how does one actually go about calculating the power requirement. This photograph shows several such cavities. As you can see that the shape of them is sometimes taken as a kind of uh, torus or meduvada kind of shape. There is a reason for that. We'll look into it at a later stage. But these are all different RF cavities of two different materials. This is copper, and the other is probably um, some other metal which is coated from inside with a highly conductive metal. Um, it looks like steel, but I am pretty sure it is not. Or even if it is steel, from the inside it is coated with a highly conductive metal like copper. And you can see they are at various shapes and sizes. Okay, that is just for a physical picture on how the RF cavity in reality looks. Okay. The panel on the right side actually shows the kind of power supplies which are used to supply power to these RF cavities. This particular type of power supply is called a klystron generator. Okay. And how it generates high amount of power is basically it takes a normal AC as an input, and you have an electron beam which is traveling through this region. So when when the electron travels to the region where the AC wave is being input, the electron beam starts getting bunched. This is a illustration of the same thing, that when the electron beam is initially incident at equal amounts of time, you are having equal current. So it's a uniform and stable beam or a steady beam. And when it passes through the AC voltage which you have applied, what will happen is the electrons which are incident during the positive half cycle will gain energy, and the ones who are in the negative half cycle, they will lose energy. So that when you input a steady beam of electrons, at the output end you get a highly bunched beam of electrons. And since this bunched beam will have very, very high current, you will be able to generate extremely high power. This is the basic idea of a klystron generator. I am not going into further detail because um, that is not the aim or purpose of this particular course, to look into the electrical engineering aspects of things. At the same time, it is very important to be aware that there will be a uh, power generator like a klystron, which will be powering, or a magnetron, that's the other type, which will be powering the RF accelerator. So there are methods in electrical engineering to obtain extremely high powers based on some simple mechanism. At least in principle or in theory, it is simple. In practice, of course, you can see it's much more elaborate. And these klystrons actually they take a lot of power, and output also they give out a lot of power. So you need to take a lot of precautions when operating the klystron type of generator. You can see that this particular one is a tabletop kind of model. It is a 1.3 megawatt klystron, so it can have extremely high power output. Okay. And this kind of klystron generator is used for powering these RF cavities. So actually, when you have a RF cavity, just as we had shown earlier, there will be another parallel tunnel which will contain the power supply. The klystron actually takes up more space than the RF cavity itself. And transferring the power generated by the klystron to the RF cavity is also a challenging field in itself. Normally, it is done through waveguides because the frequency regime lies in the several hundreds of megahertz or few gigahertz region. So accordingly, some waveguides are used to transfer the power generated by the klystron to the RF cavity. For example, in BRC, there is a high energy accelerator which is under development, which is called um, low energy high intensity proton accelerator. uh, we'll discuss about that particular accelerator at some stage during this course, but the purpose of putting that describing that accelerator is that if you visit that accelerator, then there is one large hall where the actual accelerator is placed, and there is a neighboring hall where all the power supplies are placed. So it's almost, the power supplies almost take up the same amount of space as the accelerator itself. That was the point which I wanted to make. And for shielding from the high power, etc., the whole thing is actually underground. That's the other part of it. Okay. Moving forward, the other important component which takes up a lot of power is the magnet. And as you know, in a magnet, there will be some stored energy due to the hysteresis effect. And all of these, the power requirement needed to raise the magnetic field from zero, and the amount of power required to change the magnetic field, all of this can be calculated just by studying the hysteresis curve for the magnet. Always you know that if it is a conventional magnet, then you will have an iron yoke, and the properties of the iron yoke are what determine the final magnetization properties of the magnet. Just for the purpose of understanding, a equivalent kind of circuit is shown over here. I myself am not sure how this arises, but it arises out of a straightforward electrical analysis of the magnet. And the important component here is the inductor. The inductor actually represents the coil of the magnet, and what will be the inductance in that when the magnetic field keeps changing. So you can see that the L value keeps changing from time to time as you change the magnetic field. And what is the total power which is dissipated through this circuit? I mean, the series resistance must be the coil resistance itself. I am not sure about the other components, but basically all of this circuit can be used to calculate the total power load due to that particular magnet. So that even before you design or even if you before you construct the accelerator, in the design phase, you have to figure out how many magnets you need. You have to figure out how much magnetic field you need in each one. Then you need to figure out how fast or slow the magnetic fields will switch, and then accordingly you can take this equivalent circuit and find out how much power is needed. So how do you know how much magnetic field value is needed? For that you have to talk to the uh, actual person who is going to use the accelerator, the physicist, because they will tell you that I need a particle or an energy of this much, otherwise the process which I'm trying to study won't take place at all. So then you need minimum this much energy, which means from that you can calculate the rigidity. And once you know the rigidity, and then you can, depending on the magnet technology available to you, you will decide the radius of the machine. And then once you have fixed all those things, then you will take this equivalent circuit diagram for the magnet and find out the power dissipated through this combination. And then you will zero in on the power supply which you need for that magnet. Then you will let this be known to the power supply group. They will then tell the electrical group how much power requirement they have, and so on and so forth. As I mentioned earlier, it's a complex map. Okay. But the purpose of the last two or three slides is to indicate that the it is just a problem of electrical engineering to determine how much power is required for each of these components. Okay. So once you have got that, you can actually design the power requirement part of the accelerator. This is just a few values from, actually from the Large Hadron Collider, which is in CERN in Switzerland. Uh, the purpose of this slide is to show you the kind of currents and voltages which people talk about when you are operating these particular magnets, and also what kind of stability you need in the magnet for steady operation of the beam. So uh, MB means magnetic bending, MQ is magnetic quadrupole, triplet means quadrupole triplet. Then there are various other types of magnets which have been listed here. I would like to draw your attention to a few things. One is that the currents which are involved. So several of the magnets use currents directly in kiloamperes, 13 kiloampere, 13 kiloampere, 5 to 7 kiloampere, 4 to 6 kiloamperes, 0.6 kiloamperes, 120 ampere, 60 ampere, 1 kiloampere. So you can see that all of these are having extremely high currents. Okay, first thing to note. You know that you had done the calculation for magnetic dipole, that the magnetic field is proportional to the current. So higher the current, higher the magnetic field. But really, how high do people go? It is this high. So you need a power supply and a power line, a transmission line, a wire, which will carry this amount of current. See, you know your normal household plug, plug point. Okay, the small plug is usually rated for 5 to 6 amperes, and the larger size plug is rated for 15 amperes. This one is 13 kilo amperes, 1000 times larger current. If you try to pass that through some kind of household wire, the wire will burn instantly, just melt. That much of heat is generated. So you can imagine the kind of I mean uh, technical restrictions on providing such high currents. Okay, this is the first thing which I wanted to point out. The second thing is that the voltages are relatively small, but that is not a big deal, because if you do V into I, the amount of power is still huge. It goes in the range of kilowatts for almost all. It can even go in several tens or hundreds of kilowatts. In fact, for the first magnet, it directly goes in megawatts. 13 into 190 into 1000. Okay, that is the requirement of power for just one magnet. It's a huge amount of power. Okay. The other yeah, the other thing which I want to point out is that some of the magnets have got the power supply written with a plus or minus sign, and some of them don't have a plus or minus sign. Some of them have both voltage and current with a plus or minus sign. Okay, we'll be looking at this in the next slide and trying to understand what all of this means. Okay, it depends on what kind of magnetic field what you say changes which you want to make, or how do you or how often and how fast do you want the magnets to change their value. It depends on that. And another point is the last column over here, which talks about the stability. All of these numbers are in parts per million, which means that the if the current through this magnet is a certain value, then um, it will not vary by more than 0.003%, kind of 0003. Very, very small value. It is parts per million. So if the current is, let us say, 1 kiloampere, then the variation will be less than plus or minus 3 milliamperes. Extremely small variation. Okay. So in order to ensure such stability of the magnet, even these numbers look big, 50, but it is 50 divided by 1 million. So it is still 5 into 10 power minus 5. Extremely small number. Okay. So that is the level of stability which is expected from the magnet. And this will tell you how much care and diligence has to go into the technology for designing the power supplies. Because if the power supply has to be stable, these are half hour stability numbers, which means over half an hour, it should not drift by more than this much amount, basically. So you can see the amount of care which has to go in to the design, and also not only design, the construction of these power supplies. You cannot have, for example, some of the laboratory power supplies which we get in our lab, which can go with plus minus few millivolts. Can't means which fluctuates within that range. That kind of thing can't work. So you need a very, very stable um, DC supply. You know that you have done this experiment on rectification followed by capacitor filtering. You know that there is a ripple factor associated when you convert DC to AC to DC. Though the ripple rejection of these power supplies has to be tremendous, because the fluctuation levels which are means required are much, much smaller than what you have. So line regulation, load regulation, ripple rejection, all these things have to be extremely good for these power supplies. Only then it will work properly. Okay. So this is just to point out all these things about the requirements of magnet power supplies. Same applies also to the accelerating cavities. In fact, that is even worse, because you can end up permanently damaging the klystron if you are not careful, if you don't take proper precautions. Permanently damaging money, the power will be sent back, get amplified in reverse direction, and the whole thing will burst. So um, one has to be very careful about these things. This is another picture of, again, CERN only. There are a total of 14 power distribution units around the ring. They are labeled from 1 to 14. 1 is here, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, then 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14. So they are all distributed around, which supply power to different parts of the accelerator, just as we had mentioned at the one of the initial slides. Okay. And just for a idea, the nominal current which is carried in combination by all of them is around 6 kiloamperes, and the nominal voltage is 25 kilovolts, so that the total power which one will expect at any time being delivered is 150 megawatts. This is basically, you need a small power station on site in order to keep this sustained. You cannot rely just on grid, you have to have your own backup. So but this is for a very large accelerator, but even for smaller accelerators like our own AMS, for example, we have a UPS, uninterrupted power supply. The UPS is connected only to the vacuum pumps and a few other essential components like control unit and so on. So that if the power fails from the main grid, there is a power cut, at least your accelerator is on. The accelerator will go off when a beam will shut off, but the accelerator beam line is still in vacuum. The vacuum pumps are still running. For around 20 minutes we have the UPS backup, and that itself takes a large battery bank which fills an entire room filled with car batteries, actually. I mean, literally same kind of batteries. And that is used for backing up the power, and that works only for around 20 minutes. And within those 20 minutes, the operator or whoever is in charge of the facility shift of that particular time, they have to come and switch off everything before the power completely fails. There will be much more elaborate fail safes in larger accelerators. Many of them have a backup small generator kind of thing which will kick in simultaneously with the uh, power, what to say, the power cut or the failure from the grid. Immediately the generator will kick in, and again normally that operates only the essential parts of the accelerator till you are able to manually switch everything down, or whatever automatic shutdown procedure is initiated and followed through. Okay. So 150 megawatt is not a simple number, but even for smaller accelerator also the power requirement is quite large, and this has to be taken. The special precautions have to be taken in order to ensure this. Okay. This is a explanation for the different types of power supplies. When do you need plus or minus for the voltage? When do you need plus or minus for the current, etc.? So basically, different components in the beam line, like bending magnets is a separate story, then small magnetic steerers is a separate story, and focusing or quadrupole magnets is a separate story. So, some of them you may need to tune the magnetic field in both directions, positive and negative. For example, a quadrupole, you may need to adjust over a wider range. So sometimes the voltage and the current need to be changed in such a way that you will need a negative power supply. For example, let us take the first diagram. You can see that in this region, voltage and current are not having some kind of direct relation when you are increasing the current. That is because when you start increasing the current, since the wire is coiled around the magnet in the form of a coil, it will have some inductance, and due to that inductance it will have a back EMF. And if you want the current to increase steadily, then you need to increase the voltage by much more amount so that the current will increase steadily. Similarly, when you want to reduce the current to zero, then there will be a back EMF resisting that change. So the actual voltage you apply has to be much more than just proportional to I. Okay. So the copper coil of the magnet, it has some resistance and it has some inductance. If it was a pure resistor, then voltage and current will be proportional throughout. But because it is also inductor come resistor, you will have additional voltage needed whenever you are changing the current. You can see everywhere there is a change in current, the voltage is much larger than what would have been conventionally required only passing through a wire. Okay. Once the current change stops, you then end up in Ohm's law regime. That is, voltage and current are proportional to each other. But otherwise, you keep having this. Whenever you are increasing or decreasing current, you need large voltages. So if you need the current to be only positive, but you need to both increase and decrease the current, then you need a power supply which is bipolar in the voltage regime. That is, it can provide positive voltage as well as negative voltage. If you cannot provide negative voltage, then you cannot ramp down this fast. You have to ramp down much more slowly. But that may not suit the requirements of your accelerator. The beam transport may require this to ramp down at this speed. So if you are unable to ramp down at this speed, then I mean, if you need to be able to ramp down at this speed, then you need the voltage to go negative. Similarly, if you want the current to change in the negative direction, then you need a power supply which has both negative uh, voltage as well as current is possible. So it is voltage and current bipolar. This was what I was trying to describe over here when we talk about when do you need a bipolar voltage part and when do you need a bipolar current part. Sometimes you need only the voltage to be bipolar, sometimes you need both voltage and current to be bipolar. It depends on the role of the magnets. You see, when you need both to be bipolar, these are orbit correctors which you may need to operate it in both positive current, negative current, everything you may need. Whereas the ones with only the positive voltage but no need for the negative current, these are normal bending type of magnets which will not need the negative current, because you just need to ramp it up and ramp down and nothing else. Just for illustrative purpose I am pointing this out. Okay. There is another interesting idea which has to go in at the design stage of the accelerator. Basically, you can have different types of magnets with different current densities in the coil. Okay. If there are large current densities in the coil, then you need the magnet to be water cooled. If there are only small current densities, then you can make do with air cooled. Okay. If the current density is more, then the running cost is more because the power supply requirement is more, because larger current means larger I square R type of loss. So you will end up with larger running costs. Okay. On the other hand, if you are operating at smaller current density, still the capital cost for the magnet is anyway large. Okay. Capital cost means initial investment on the iron and the copper and other things which need to go into constructing the magnet. Even if you are going to operate it at lower what you say current, you still have to pay for the iron core, you still have to pay for the copper. So the capital cost is one consideration and running cost is the other consideration. And so uh, it depends on how long and how much you are going to operate the accelerator. That will also play a role on what type of magnets you need. And there is always an optimum current density where your lifetime cost of the whole thing will be minimum. And normally one tries to aim to be somewhere in this region. So you still have a wide choice, but not too low current densities, not too high, somewhere in between. That is a good region to operate the, I mean, it will minimize your long term costs. This is another consideration which has to go in at design stage, how long you expect the accelerator project to last, and accordingly the magnet technologies etc have to be invested in, because some of it is one time investment and some of it is recurring investment of the cost. So you have to take both into account before you decide what is it exactly which you want to do. Okay. And there are various methods of current measurement which can accurately measure the current. Some of these devices are then used in feedback with the power controller, which helps to maintain the stability of that current within that few ppm level, which was described in the description table for the different power supplies at LHC. Okay, this is just a chart type of thing, and uh, I mean, anyway, the video of this will be available to you, so you can have a look at that time, pause it, and study it in as much detail as you wish. But my point with this slide is that there are several different methods for precisely measuring the current, and then um, using that for maybe a better control and trying to maintain that particular magnetic field or that particular current using a feedback mechanism. My bottom line is there are various ways to do it, which very precise technologies which people have come up with, which can go. Some of them can go to very high precision like ppm level. Some of them are more 0.1% or 1% type of. All of these are available. All right. Sorry. I would like to pause at this point, and if there are any questions, queries, comments, we can have those right now. Thank you. All right, let us move forward then. The next, I mean, next few slides, we will talk about the second important part, peripheral system to an accelerator, that is vacuum. Uh, Particularly about vacuum, it is a very understated part because it's notoriously difficult to get good vacuum in any vacuum system. Okay, lots of precautions are involved, and I can tell you many stories of how we have struggled to get even minor leaks fixed, where we couldn't figure out at all where the leak is, and went through many iterations before we figured out how to stop the leak and so on. Okay, so yeah, we have vacuum systems. Basically, I don't know how many of you had experimental physics as a course. I think half of you. This was the show of hands we had last time. Roughly half the class had experimental physics. So you must have studied vacuum techniques in that, right? Yes.
Yes, sir.
So at least you are familiar with some of the concepts related with vacuum, including pumping speed, etc. But let us take it nice and slow so that everyone is on the same page. Basically, vacuum technologies, uh, they rely on pumping out the air or the whatever gas is there in a given volume. Uh, Initially, you can mechanically force out the air, similar to a you suck out the air using a vacuum cleaner kind of thing. This is the basic vacuum which can go from atmosphere. Atmosphere is basically 1 bar, or it can also be called 760 millimeters of mercury. The usual units used for measuring vacuum in vacuum technology are 1 millibar or 1 millimeter of mercury, which is called as 1 torr. So atmospheric pressure is basically 760 torr or 1000 millibar, whichever you prefer. Okay. So let us talk in terms of torr. So atmospheric pressure is 760 torr, and a, a pump which is shown on the left, which is called a rotary pump, which is basically sucking out the air more or less. It is like putting a tube to the vacuum chamber and like pulling all the air basically. That can bring your pressure down from 760 torr to around 10 power minus 2 or 10 power minus 3 torr, which means around 5 orders of magnitude or 6 orders of magnitude from atmospheric pressure. ठीक है. This particular regime of vacuum is called the base vacuum regime. ठीक है. Once you have achieved this pressure of 10 power minus 3 torr, basically when you reduce the pressure, what happens? The mean free path increases. Right. So when the mean free path has increased, when the pressure is so low as 10 power minus 3 millibar, which is around 10 power minus 6 atmospheres, by the way, for your reference, just so that you get a picture. Very, very low pressure. Uh, at that time, what happens is that the molecule's mean free path is so high that the collisions with the walls of the chamber are much more likely than collision with each other. So the gas no longer behaves like a fluid, collective motion of several molecules, but it starts behaving like several isolated molecules which are not talking with each other. They are more likely to collide with the wall than with each other. At that stage, it no longer becomes possible to suck out the air by conventional means, because when you are sucking out something, the assumption behind that is that the thing you are sucking out is a fluid. For example, if you drink a cold drink with a straw, you are able to suck it because uh, all the molecules have cohesive forces along with each other, and then they start climbing through that straw when you try to pull it. But if the number of molecules is very, very small, then if you pull one molecule, there is no guarantee that another molecule will also come. So there is no way of really getting them to move just by providing a suction power. So the base vacuum regime stops at around 10 power minus 3, which is also called the fluid flow regime because the gas flows as a fluid. After that, you enter what is called the molecular flow regime, where, as we just discussed, the individual molecules move separately. So then the next stage of vacuum, which is called high vacuum, which goes from around 10 power minus 3 millibar to, let us say, 10 power minus 8 or minus 9 millibar, minus 8 pakdo fir bhi. Uh, what you try to do at that stage is to wait around till a molecule reaches you and then push him out of the system. Uh, Imagine a cricket batsman who is waiting with a bat. As soon as the ball comes, he hits it. So suppose your batsman is well trained, then he can hit it in the region where you want. So if you have a pipe somewhere in the cricket field, whenever the bowler bowls the ball, he'll hit the ball into that pipe. Next ball, pipe. Third ball, pipe. Like that, एक molecule करके बाहर निकालना पड़ता है system में से, because the molecules are moving individually, they are not moving collectively. ठीक है? There are several types of pumps which can do that. The one which is depicted in the center picture is something called a turbomolecular pump. You can see it has several blades over here. Each of these blade is like a bat, which I was telling you about. So that molecule comes here, it gets hit in the downward direction and gets sucked out through this pipe. That's the basic mechanism of working for a turbomolecular pump. These blades are rotating at extremely high rotation speeds, typically 500, 600 hertz, sometimes even 1000 hertz. Very, very fast rotation speeds. Molecule comes randomly, gets hit, goes down, and gets sucked out from here. That's the basic uh, concept of this kind of pump. Another type of pump which is used for high vacuum is the diffusion pump, where a jet of oil vapor is incident on an umbrella shaped object here, which comes down. And as the oil vapor comes down, any random molecule which comes from here will get carried away with it. So it is like a waterfall kind of thing, so that in the waterfall, if someone falls, then that person also gets swept away. Something of that kind you can imagine. So different types of pumps are there which can actually displace the gas out of the system, and you can achieve pressures of up to 10 power minus 8 torr inside the chamber using these mechanisms. After that, even this kind of mechanism becomes very, very difficult. Then the next stage of pumps comes in, which are called ultra high vacuum pumps, which can go anywhere from 10 power minus 8 minus 9 right up to 10 power minus 12 and minus 13 torr, which means that you have basically from Avogadro number of molecules, that is 10 power 23 number of molecules, you have gone down by around 15 orders of magnitude. You cannot get much better than that in laboratory systems. At that stage, basic diffusion of the gas through the walls of the chamber starts coming into the picture. So it becomes impossible basically. Uh, okay. The pump which is shown, the picture which is shown in the right panel is something called a cryogenic pump or a cryo pump. Basically, the concept is very simple. What they do is you have this object which is shaped like a inverted U shape. You can see that bold kind of thing. What is done is that this thing is cooled down to cryogenic temperature, extremely low temperatures. So any gas molecules which comes there, it just gets deposited on this and becomes frozen like an ice. So you can get argon ice, oxygen ice, nitrogen ice on this particular cold head. And at some stage, once the cold head is saturated, this gets sealed off, and all of this the cold head is heated up, and all this material then goes and gets pulled out. Then again you cool it down and then again open the valve. So from time to time it can absorb all these different gases, and those gases can then get pumped out. There is another type of pump which is called a sorption pump, which works on similar principles. The idea is that you have a highly uh, adsorbent material where any gas which goes and it has a very high sticking coefficient. Any gas which goes and sits will get adsorbed. Activated surface is there which has basically has dangling bonds, so that as soon as any molecule comes it will get adsorbed, and that can also be used for obtaining extremely high vacuum. These are some of the different types of vacuum systems which are used, and depending on the vacuum requirement in the accelerator, you will try to use different types of pumps. Vacuum requirement, there was a basic problem which was there in one of the tutorials. I hope you must have seen that, right? So basic vacuum requirements have to be calculated, that what kind of vacuum do I need and what kind of pumping speed do I need. Each of these pumps is characterized by a pumping speed and a ultimate vacuum which it can achieve. So you have to calculate what is the ultimate vacuum I need, ultimate pressure, and what is the pumping speed I need, and accordingly the choice of pump has to be made. Sometimes you need a pressure not better than 10 power minus 7 torr, for example, I am saying, but you need you have a large gas load because you are using inputting some gas for your experiment. So you need the pumping speed to be high so that that kind of vacuum can be maintained. Pumping speed is usually measured in a unit called millibar liter per second or torr liter per second. So liter the no sorry the pumping speed is measured in liters per second, and the gas throughput is measured in millibar liter per second, so that one can come to know how much of what you say uh, how much of pumping speed you need for a particular system, when you know how much gas is coming in from the various components of the system. Okay. Anyway, this is not a class on vacuum technology. For further reading, you can refer to the book by Roth, Vacuum Technology, extremely well written and nice book. You can have a look. This is a explanatory kind of note on why you require high vacuum in an accelerator. The picture shows a beam which contains I number of particles per second per centimeter square. That is the beam intensity. and each of the target particles which it is going to hit has a cross sectional area of sigma. Sigma need not be the geometric cross section, it can be also the interaction cross section, as obtained either through classical or quantum mechanical formula. And you have a density of n atoms per centimeter cube of the target atoms, which are here, the big circles. The projectiles which are coming, the beam particles are not actually shown, just the arrows are shown. So as this beam passes through this region, you will find that the number of beam particles which get obscured will be di is equal to minus I n sigma times dx. This is fairly obvious from normal considerations. The n sigma dx is the volume of the region behind this particular atom. So any particle from the beam which was coming through that region will get stopped at some point and not go further. So this is straightforward. Dx itself can be written as the velocity of the beam times dt. And if you substitute this here, you get a first order differential equation, which is a very standard one. And the solution turns out to be I is equal to I0 e to the power minus t by tau, where tau is the beam lifetime kind of quantity, which is 1 over sigma times n times v. So the bottom line of this whole argument is, if you want the beam to survive for longer, then you need tau to be high, which means that you need this quantity to be low. However, v is the velocity of the beam particles, which is determined on the basis of what kind of process you want to carry out. So you need to have this independently changeable. Sigma is the cross section which you have no control over. It is a kind of God given quantity. The only quantity which you have control over is the number density of atoms. If you reduce the number density, you get longer beam lifetimes. This lifetime is not related to the decay based lifetime which we have studied for muons, etc., which was there in one of the problems. This lifetime is just the survival lifetime because of repeated collisions with the gas molecules. Okay. So if you want the beam to survive for a longer time, better the vacuum you have, longer the beam will survive. If you have 10 power minus 6 torr vacuum inside the vacuum, inside the beam line, and your beam survives for 1 hour, let us say, before going reducing drastically, then if you increase the vacuum to 10 power minus 7 torr, it will survive for 10 hours. This is a basic idea which is being expressed over here. And so if you don't want your beam particles to get what you say lost, then you need high vacuum inside the chamber. There is another consideration also, especially when you come to atomic and molecular physics kind of experiments using accelerators. Also other fields, but particularly pertinent for atomic and molecular physics. The fact is that if you are trying to study the interaction of the beam particles with one particular type of gas atom, then you have to ensure that all other gas atoms have been removed from the system before you can start the study of that particular gas which you are interested in. For example, Kalpesh is right now going to TI for his project part, and they are doing some of these experiments like this. So there you need to evacuate all other gases before you inlet your gas which you want to study. So that is another consideration why you need large or high vacuum inside an accelerator. I mean, that is more from an experimental consideration, but basically in the entire accelerator tube also you need that high vacuum so that the beam will get transported. That is part number one. And number two is that you get the output or the signal only from the type of interaction which you want to study and not from some random interaction with the residual background gas inside the chamber. ठीक है. uh, Another important uh, aspect of vacuum technology, this is practical use of vacuum technology for accelerators, is that um, often if you go to an accelerator facility, you will find that the whole accelerator beamline is wrapped in some aluminum type of material or something, and when you go nearby it will be a bit hot. This is a process which is called as baking of the vacuum system. Basically, you heat the vacuum system so that any gas which is adsorbed on the inner surface of the walls will start uh, coming out. Okay, so that when you keep heating like that, the adsorbed gas gets dislodged from the walls, and in the end, you end up with a much lower vacuum. You can see this, that if you have not baked uh, the vacuum chamber walls, then basically you end up with a final outgassing rate which is quite high, which means that per unit time a significant number of molecules keep getting released from the walls in a random fashion. Whereas if you bake it, many of these molecules get dislodged and get sucked away in the initial pumping down phase itself, so that at a later stage your outgassing rate is much lower, which means that per unit time less molecules are released from the walls because less molecules are present on the walls. Most of them got dislodged by the heating. So you will find in accelerators many times they have this kind of heating tapes which they wrap around different parts of the accelerator. Different accelerator laboratories have different ways of doing this. Some people have these blocks of asbestos sheets with a coil inside. Some people have this tape which is, it is very interesting. It's a basically a copper flat copper wire, flat braided copper wire, and around that there is a sheet of mica. Mica is a strange kind of material. It is a good conductor of heat but a poor conductor of electricity, and that heating tape is then wrapped around the whole what you say part of the accelerator or the vacuum system which you want to degas or bake. And then sometimes people put aluminum foil on top of that, so that that aluminum foil, whatever heat is coming out, it will get reflected back inside, and so you get double effect of that. And after baking you get much better vacuum. This I can tell you from experience. Number of times we have had to bake our vacuum systems, and you get a much better result, means much better vacuum at the end. Okay, so this is one of the ideas. Another idea which I'll mention, which is, there is no slide on that, whenever you are breaking the vacuum, suppose you want to change a component inside the accelerator system, then you have to break the vacuum completely, open it, then do the modification which you need, again close it, and again pump out all the air which is there. The venting, that is the initial uh, inletting of gas to bring the vacuum system back to atmosphere pressure, many times instead of air people use nitrogen gas, and on rare occasions argon gas also. The purpose of this is that if you vent the whole system with nitrogen gas, then when you actually open the system, atmospheric air which contains water vapor, that will go and deposit on top of the nitrogen layer which is already formed on the surface. So next time when you are pumping the system again and removing all the gas, nitrogen has less affinity for any surface because it is not a polar molecule. Water being a polar molecule, once it goes and sticks on some surface, it's extremely difficult to dislodge from that surface. So if you have vented the system with nitrogen instead of normal air, when you pump down, the pumping process becomes much smoother and you get the desired vacuum much quicker. This is, I'm telling you from experience again, means not my experience alone. Like lot of people, this is a commonly used practice to vent the system with nitrogen instead of air. in many accelerators, especially synchrotron facilities, etc., where there is a possibility of beam hitting on the sides. In a synchrotron facility, the particle beam doesn't hit on the sides, but the photons which are emitted, some of them will hit on the sides. And when they hit, due to that hitting of the photons, there will be a large number of gas molecules being released from the surface, which were actually adsorbed tightly on the surface. Okay. So this diagram on the left, it shows the different gases and what are their desorption yields, that is molecules per photon of synchrotron radiation. As you increase the photon uh, dose, actually the desorption yield changes. But basically the only purpose of showing this diagram is to tell you that in synchrotron facilities, when the photon beam hits on the walls, you will get some amount of gas coming out. You can see that for aluminum these numbers are higher compared to copper. For aluminum, this number, for hydrogen, let us say, is in the range of 5 or 6 into 10 power minus 2. Here it is in the range of 3 into 10 power minus 3. So the material of the chamber also matters. Many times it is stainless steel, but here the example is taken for aluminum and copper. Okay. And as the amount of gas is keeps on getting desorbed, there will be a saturation point where the amount of degassing rate will come to a constant value. So after that, the photon cannot dislodge the further molecules of that type. This is another point over here. But the broader context of this whole slide is that one has to also worry about this, that beam hitting will dislodge some gas molecules. So one has to take care that that does not interfere in any way with the experiment, nor it reduces the quality of the beam. In most of the vacuum systems in accelerators, you have pumps at regular distances along the accelerator. And this is a model calculation for if you have a if you have two pumps, each of them having a pumping speed of 2s. The 2 is taken for convenience of the calculation actually, and they are separated in distance by a distance of 2l. Then the average pressure in the beam tube in this entire region, the pressure will obviously be lowest near the pump, and it will be highest at the point between two pumps, because here this is closer to the region. So this region will have lesser density of molecules. Here you will have more, but the difference is not much. It is the same order of magnitude only. Okay. And the average pressure is given in terms of the pumping speed, the length, that is the distance between the two pumps, and the conductance, that is how much the gas can the conductance is basically the inverse conductance is basically the resistance, that how much resistance is there to the flow of the gas. So conductance is how well the gas can flow through this region. So you can see that the average pressure will be inversely proportional to the pumping speed. So higher the pumping speed, lower is the average pressure, which is well understandable. Higher the conductance of the gas, lower is the pressure, which is again understandable. If the conductance is good, the gas will travel quickly and you will get better pumping. The conductance is a property of um, the adsorption coefficient of the gas on the walls of the chamber and the nature of the gas. Okay, what type of molecules it consists of, what are the mass, and so on. Also, if you increase the length between two pumps, then the pressure is directly proportional to that. So the pressure also increases, which is also understandable, because the larger the distance, the region between the two pumps will get less amount of pumping, and so the average pressure will increase. Okay. The purpose of this particular equation is to just show the functional dependence on various parameters. So if I want a better pressure in this, my first thing is that I need to increase the pumping speed of the pumps. Okay, but only increasing the pumping speed is not sufficient. Sometimes if the inherent conductance of the gas is not good, then anyway it won't help beyond a certain limit. Okay, so the other possibility is to reduce the length between the pumps. With these two parameters in hand, that is the length and the pumping speed, and the conductance also depends on the cross sectional area. So you can increase the cross sectional area, but sometimes that is not possible because of other design constraints of the accelerator. So for a given conductance, one can decide based on the pumping speed and the length on what pressure one can achieve. If that is not good enough, either increase the pumping speed or decrease the distance between the pumps. So once you have designed the dimensions of the beam tube so that that fixes the conductance, and you have decided how much pressure you want in the beam line, accordingly one can calculate the pumping speed of the pumps which is required. And also the length part is a part of the design consideration for the accelerator. You cannot randomly place them very close or something. So um, the conductance and the length are fixed by the geometry of the accelerator. The average pressure is fixed by the physics of the accelerator, and the pumping speed can then be calculated from on the basis of these quantities. Okay, so the purpose of this diagram and this formula is to just illustrate that uh, one can obtain the pumping speed required for maintaining a particular pressure once you are given certain parameters such as what is the conductance and what is the distance between the neighboring pumps. Okay, uh, I think this is okay then. All right. This is just one more, actually two more independent things. I don't know why they are together. I think they were from the same CERN accelerator school notes. This is an example of what happens in a cold storage ring, that is a cryogenically cooled storage ring. You can see that at different temperatures, the vapor pressure of, let us say, hydrogen gas, which is the dominant. This is from CERN, so proton beam. That is why they get hydrogen formed at various places. At different temperatures, the vapor pressure is different. But once you come to very low temperatures, the vapor pressure is very small, and this fall is very drastic. At 4 Kelvin, the vapor pressure is 10 power minus 6 star. On the other hand, when you come down to 3 Kelvin, it is 10 power minus 9 torr. It's drastic reduction in vapor pressure as you come down in temperature, very close to absolute zero. Okay, and beyond a certain point, uh, once the surface has been depleted, you have only one monolayer of hydrogen. So you have only one single layer, and uh, that's it. Uh, it's a very thin layer of hydrogen. Okay. The other diagram is to show that when there is a large magnetic field which is applied, then the beam tube itself experiences slight amount of distortion. Okay, and the whole thing is continuously cooled with a helium kind of uh, cryogenic cooling. Okay, and due to the induced current in that particular wall, you get an additional force on the beam line. So the dimensions, the materials which are used for the beam line also have to be decided. If you are going down to such low temperatures, then one, and such large magnetic fields, then one has to be very careful about the materials which one uses for the what you say, design of the accelerator. I mean, you have to check the compatibility between the magnetic field technology you are using, the cryogenic technology you are using, and the materials you are using for designing the other components of the accelerator, which are not directly associated with either the magnetic field or the cryogenics, because large magnetic field or low temperatures may affect different materials differently. So you have to ensure that, means you cannot say I want cryogenic but मेरे को यही material चाहिए. You have to choose the material accordingly which can withstand such low temperatures and not change the properties. You have to use a material which can withstand being in the presence of a 10 Tesla magnetic field but not change the properties. Okay. So uh, that consideration is very important, that what kind of materials you use for especially in such extreme large magnetic field or low temperature situations. It's just an extra note, actually not related to anything else we have been discussing, but it is important nevertheless. Okay, at this point I would like to again pause, and if there are some questions or queries we can take those, please. All right, if not, then let us move further. Another important, extremely important thing is the ability to detect leaks, because in a large vacuum system, if you achieve the vacuum, then good, everyone is happy. If vacuum is not coming for a certain reason, then anywhere in the entire vacuum system there could be a leak, which is leading to that situation where you are not able to achieve the vacuum. In that kind of situation, how do you find out where is the leak located? The methodology which is used for this is basically the following. You have a system called a leak detector. Let us focus on the right hand side picture first. Okay. The leak detector is connected to the vacuum chamber which you are studying, and you spray some helium gas at various points in the chamber. If there is a leak at one particular point, when you spray the helium gas will enter the chamber, and from there it will get pumped into the leak detector. And the leak detector is a detector which is sensitive to helium. So now let us come to this diagram on the left. Basically, once the helium gas enters from the chamber and enters through this into the leak detector, basically what it undergoes is the following. The gas comes, let us say, from the bottom. It gets bombarded by an electron beam which is inbuilt as part of this leak detector, gets ionized, and that ionized helium passes through a region of electric field such that the electric field value is chosen to bend only the helium through this hole, and then it enters into a ion detector. The actual physical model of this is shown in the bottom panel. You can see there is an entrance slit. The electron gun, etc., is somewhere at the bottom here. It gets ionized. Ion comes from here. The electric field between this plate and this plate is such that it will bend, and only helium ion will bend in the correct radius. Others will not. It's an electric field, so it's a basic energy selector. There is a small acceleration here, and the helium ion then enters into this, and the detector is here. This is the basic construction of this helium based leak detector. Helium is used because helium has a very high diffusion coefficient. It's a light gas, so even through very minute cracks, etc., it can pass through, and so it is easy to obtain the leak, locate the leak easily. Okay. And actually this is great fun to do in in laboratory, trying to find out where is the leak. Of course you have to be very careful and pinpointed where you are spraying the helium. If you indiscriminately spray a lot of helium all over the lab, then it will keep showing you leak at random places where actually there is no leak. because helium will diffuse even in the lab. And if you spray it at point A and the leak is at point B, it will take some time for the helium to diffuse from here to there, and suddenly it will start showing that there is a leak. But it will not be at the point where you are spraying helium, but it will be at some other point. So you have to do this very, very carefully. But one can detect the leak easily. This is a standard method, helium based leak detector. There are several other modes of configuration for this. You can have a helium balloon around the accelerator, pump the whole thing with helium, and have the leak detector connected like this. You can also do reverse. You can fill the whole chamber with helium gas and then use the leak detector from outside to detect at various points. This is called sniffer mode of operation, the third panel. Sniffer because it is sniffing, trying to smell out where is the leak, kind of. That is the logic. And you can have a leak detection blanket around the chamber and then flood the chamber with helium and allow for the leak to be detected. This only tells you whether there is leak or not. It doesn't tell you where is the leak. Same thing with this guy. It only tells you leak hai ki nahi hai. These two, the left two panels, tell you where exactly the leak is located. Okay. So this is about leak detection. It's an extremely important phase. Each part of the accelerator is separately leak tested just to ensure that there are no leaks or there is no defect in any of the components. It's extremely important because without the vacuum, you cannot start the beam. So the vacuum is primary prerequisite. One has to be careful about that. So just to summarize about the vacuum system part, the design of the vacuum system is influenced strongly by beam parameters. Particularly, uh, the beam currents can sometimes have a role to play based on what are the secondary emissions, etc., which will take place. The beam velocities will have a role to play. The beam energies will have a role to play, because if you notice the lifetime of the beam, it has a factor of beam energy somewhere. So all those will be important. And when you are commissioning the vacuum system, that is when you are starting the operation of the vacuum system, normally the correct standard procedure or protocol is you pump down that particular section of the vacuum system, leak check it so that you are sure that there is no leak. Then you keep it for bake out, that is wrap it around with a heating tape and leave it on for few days, and all the gas which is on the inside of the vacuum tube and the vacuum system, all of it will get degassed or desorbed and get pumped out from the system. Then one needs to check out all the components, especially uh, the vacuum pumps, vacuum gauges at various points, which will tell you what is the vacuum at various locations. Then there are vacuum feed throughs, etc., for putting the power supply inside the vacuum for various components, etc. All of those, all of these can be checked individually. And then one can check out the interlocks and safety checks. For example, if a certain pump fails, then normally there will be an interlock which will immediately shut down that particular part or isolate that particular part of the vacuum system. Two valves at two ends of that region or that zone will get shut off, so that that particular part of the accelerator is isolated from the remaining part. Okay. So all these interlocks, if the temperature goes high, then everything should shut down automatically. If the pressure rises beyond a certain limit, the beam should switch off automatically. All these interlocks and safety checks and balances can be checked up at the end. And then during the regular running of the accelerator, continuously the maintenance is required, because in a large, for example, let me tell you, our AMS in UDP, it's a very small accelerator. It has 6 or 7 turbomolecular pumps at various locations. I think 7. So even if one of the pumps fails, the overall accelerator won't work properly. So out of 7 identical pumps, one of the pumps failing is a very routine thing. Okay? Very routine in the sense not going to happen all the time, but like uh, each pump, suppose you take a lifetime of around 10 years roughly on an average, then once in 2 years or once in 1.5 years, one of the pumps will keep failing one after the other. Ideally they shouldn't, but it is possible to happen. So you can realize that continuously there will be a maintenance unit will be needed, and in many major accelerator facilities you do have a dedicated group which is just working on the vacuum system operation and maintenance is a full time job. You cannot have it हाँ vacuum pump लगा दिया अभी मेरा काम हो गया. It is not like that. ठीक है. And this statement is taken up from I think some book, but it's a very, I felt it's a very very important statement, so that is why it is put up in the form of a quotation. Basically it says the proper planning of the commissioning phase is an integral part of vacuum system planning. One should be aware that locating and repairing helium leaks in the insulating vacuum system will be a difficult and time consuming task. Imagine you have a 27-kilometer ring like CERN, and you are asked to see whether vacuum is all right. Obviously, you will try to do it in phases. So that's what he is mentioning. Commissioning parts of the system as early as possible will be advantageous in order to apply modifications to the remaining part of the system when necessary. In a large accelerator, you have a repeated unit of many magnet quadrupole plus pump plus gauge plus whatnot. So if there is some technical problem in one of them, if you design one part of the beam line and evacuate it and check it for leaks and then see whether the pumping, the pressure is coming as predicted and so on. If it is not, then it will help you to actually get that modification done so that the remaining part of the accelerator then comes up to the standard which is required. That's what he means anyway. Okay. So this is about vacuum systems summary, and I think I am more or less done with what I wanted to do today. Okay. This is just they I used to give handouts of this when in regular class. So this is just for notes. But anyway, this is not a handout. So we can stop at this point. If there are any questions, you can ask. Thank you.